September 1st, 1939. The thunder of German jackboots echoed across Polish soil as mechanized columns thrust like daggers into the heart of the nation. Victory would be swift. Victory would be absolute. But the seeds of this catastrophe had been planted in blood 2 decades earlier. November 1918. Germany's armies stumbled home not as conquerors, but as the defeated. For years of relentless carnage in the trenches of World War I had ground down the once mighty German war machine. Kaiser Wilhelm II, their emperor, had been forced from his throne in disgrace. British, French, and American troops pressed forward in an unstoppable tide. At home, the German people faced a winter of starvation and despair. Yet, even in defeat, a poisonous lie took root in the German consciousness, a myth that would fester and grow. The generals whispered it. The soldiers repeated it. They claimed they hadn't been defeated on the battlefield at all. No, they insisted they had been stabbed in the back by cowardly politicians who surrendered when victory was within reach. Then came the moment that was supposed to end all wars. November 11th, 1918. The 11th hour of the 11th day of the 11th month. Silence fell across the Western Front. The guns stopped firing. World War I was over. The false dawn. President Woodrow Wilson of the United States arrived in Europe the following month like a prophet bearing promises of salvation. He painted visions of a new world order, a brotherhood of nations that would never again resort to the savage butchery of war. The world's leaders gathered and signed their names to his dream, the League of Nations. At Versailles, in the shadow of French grandeur, they hammered out their peace treaty. From now on, they declared, nations would settle their disputes with words, not weapons. Debate would replace bloodshed. The map of Europe was redrawn with surgical precision. The vast Austro-Hungarian Empire was carved into pieces like a carcass. New nations sprang into existence overnight. Austria, Poland, Hungary, Czechoslovakia, Yugoslavia, Latvia, Lithuania, Estonia. Germany itself was sliced down to size, territory stripped away as punishment. But within this new order lurked a time bomb, ticking quietly toward detonation. Not everyone celebrated these new borders. Several of the freshly minted nations contained substantial German minorities, communities that still spoke German, still thought of themselves as German, still yearned to return to the fatherland. One day, that yearning would set Europe ablaze. The victors had one final humiliation to inflict upon defeated Germany. Reparations. A staggering sum of £6.6 billion to be paid to France and Britain. Compensation for the devastation of war. It was a crushing burden that Germany could scarcely afford. And then Wilson's grand vision collapsed like a house of cards. When he returned to America, the U.S. Congress rejected his League of Nations. They would not risk American blood in another European war. The United States retreated into isolationism, turning its back on the continent it had helped save. The Weimar powder keg. Germany emerged from the war, transformed beyond recognition. Still Europe's most populous nation, but now stripped of its militaristic monarchy. It had become a democracy. Yet this fragile Weimar Republic was about to be hammered by blow after devastating blow. The streets of German cities became battlegrounds. Right-wing nationalists clashed with communist revolutionaries determined to bring down the system. Blood flowed in urban warfare. Then came 1923, and with it an economic apocalypse. Hyperinflation exploded like a bomb in the heart of the German economy. Prices doubled not yearly, not monthly, but in weeks, even days. A loaf of bread that cost marks in the morning required wheelbarrows full of worthless currency by afternoon. The life savings of ordinary Germans evaporated like morning mist. This was perfect soil for a new breed of demagogue to take root. The rise of the rabble-rouser. Adolf Hitler. The name would become synonymous with evil, but in those desperate days, he was just another angry voice in the chaos. Born in Austria, he had fought with fierce courage as a German soldier in World War I. The Iron Cross pinned to his chest testified to his bravery. After the war, he drifted to Munich, where his gift for fiery oratory allowed him to seize control of a marginal political group, the National Socialist German Workers' Party, the Nazis. October 1923. Hitler and his thugs attempted an armed coup against the Weimar government. The putsch failed spectacularly. He was thrown into prison for 9 months. In his cell, Hitler poured his venom onto paper, writing Mein Kampf, my struggle. The Jews, he scrawled, were to blame for all of Germany's miseries. Germany must rebuild its strength. Germany must seize new territories in the East. Germany must rise again. Released from prison, Hitler transformed the Nazis into a disciplined political machine. He would use democracy itself as the weapon to destroy democracy. For the next 5 years, the Weimar Republic actually prospered. The extremists on both left and right watched their support dwindle. Hitler seemed destined for the dustbin of history. Then fate handed him his opportunity on a silver platter. The Great Collapse. October 1929. Wall Street. The American stock market didn't just decline, it imploded. Billions of dollars vanished into thin air. The shockwave rippled across the Atlantic, across the entire globe. The Great Depression descended like a shroud over the world economy. In Germany, unemployment exploded past 6 million. Desperate people turned to desperate solutions. Only the extremists seemed to offer answers. Politicians like Hitler. By 1931, the Nazis had become a genuine mass movement. Their brown-shirted storm troopers, the SA, numbered nearly 3 million strong. A private army loyal only to Hitler, ready to crack skulls and intimidate voters. The 1932 elections made the Nazis the largest party in the Reichstag, Germany's parliament. But Hitler refused to compromise, refused to join a coalition. Parliament ground to a halt, paralyzed. To break the deadlock, President Hindenburg made a fateful choice. In January 1933, he appointed Hitler as chancellor, head of the government. Within weeks, the Reichstag building was engulfed in flames. Hitler immediately blamed the communists and demanded emergency powers to save the nation. Those powers became the knife he used to slash through German democracy. All other political parties were banned overnight. August 1934. President Hindenburg died. Hitler declared himself both chancellor and president. He was now the absolute ruler of Germany, the Führer, the secret rearmament. At first, Hitler played his hand carefully. For 3 years, he focused on resurrecting Germany's shattered economy. Millions were spent on massive public works projects, including the revolutionary Autobahn system that would eventually stretch for 5,000 miles, designed to absorb the army of unemployed. But in secret, hidden from the world's eyes, Hitler was spending even more lavishly on something else entirely: weapons. Tanks, planes, submarines. A massive rearmament program that violated every clause of the Versailles Treaty. The treaty had strangled Germany's military, limiting its army to a pathetic 100,000 men. It forbade tanks, forbade an air force, forbade submarines. Hitler ignored every restriction. The small army tripled in size. Then, in 1935, he threw off the mask. He unveiled the Luftwaffe, a brand new air force bristling with 2,500 aircraft, more planes than Britain and France combined. Unemployment plummeted. The Nazis became wildly popular. The German people loved their Führer. Now emboldened, Hitler made his first territorial grab. In 1935, the Saarland district on the French border voted to return from League of Nations control to German rule. Hitler's forces marched in triumphantly. A year later, he sent troops into the demilitarized Rhineland, directly violating the Versailles Treaty. Neither Britain nor France lifted a finger to stop him. Many felt Hitler was merely reclaiming what was rightfully German territory anyway. When Berlin hosted the 1936 Olympic Games, the Nazi regime basked in international admiration. They seemed firm but fair, a government restoring national pride without threatening anyone. Of course, there were warning signs. The 1935 Nuremberg laws stripped Jews of their citizenship and forbade them from marrying pure Aryans. But when the first real threats to world peace emerged, they didn't come from Hitler at all. They came from the Far East. The rising sun. Japan at the dawn of the 20th century was already a military powerhouse. It had crushed Russia in war in 1905. It had fought alongside the Allies in World War I. After the war, Japan was recognized as a world power and joined the League of Nations. But beneath the surface, Japan was a seething contradiction. Nominally a democracy, yet feudal traditions ran deep in the Japanese soul. Most Japanese worshipped their emperor as a living god, their true leader. And Japan faced a critical problem. Its population was exploding while its islands lacked the natural resources to fuel rapidly expanding industries. Japanese leaders looked across the sea for solutions. They found them in Chinese Manchuria. Manchuria was a land of rich grain fields, abundant coal, and mineral wealth. A perfect target, and Japanese troops were already stationed there. Other targets beckoned as well. The European colonies scattered across Asia, Burma, Malaya, and Hong Kong under British control, Indochina ruled by France, the Dutch East Indies. But Japan had to tread carefully. They couldn't afford to provoke the sleeping giant across the Pacific, the United States. For all its anti-imperialist rhetoric, America ran an unofficial empire in the Pacific. The Philippines, Guam, and several other islands were under direct American rule. The United States undoubtedly possessed the strength to crush Japan. But since World War I, America had been distracted by other pursuits. The Jazz Age and the crash. This was America's Jazz Age. Throughout the roaring 1920s, the nation became obsessed with exploiting its vast resources. An economic boom seemed to have no end. Fortunes were minted in industry and the stock markets. America lost itself in the relentless pursuit of pleasure. With such distractions, Japan's growing ambitions in the Pacific seemed impossibly distant. America had slashed its army after World War I to a skeleton force. It had agreed to a naval reduction treaty with Britain, France, and Japan that effectively handed naval superiority in the Pacific to the Japanese on a platter. And then came the Great Depression, crashing down like an avalanche. As economic devastation spread across America, a quarter of the population lost their jobs. Tens of thousands became homeless, huddling in shantytowns. Where once America had been distracted by pleasure, now it was consumed by pain. It was time for Japan to strike. The Manchurian Gambit. Without even informing their own elected government in Tokyo, Japanese forces in Manchuria seized the capital, Mukden, then swept across the rest of the territory like a plague. A puppet state called Manchukuo was proclaimed. To give it legitimacy, the Japanese dragged Henry Pui, the last emperor of China, deposed back in 1911, out of retirement and installed him as their puppet ruler. At its headquarters in Geneva, the League of Nations faced its first supreme test. Japan was universally condemned. But Japan's response was blunt and brutal. They simply walked out of the League. The League suddenly realized a terrible truth. It had no teeth. It could condemn. It could condemn all day long. But it couldn't actually do anything about Manchuria. Japan was declared an international pariah. But Japanese leaders didn't care. Their eyes were already fixed on further conquests in China. China was ripe for the taking. The government of General Chiang Kai-shek was locked in a death struggle with Mao Zedong's Communist Party. Civil war raged across the country. In 1936, as a precursor to invasion, Japan signed a pact with Hitler. The aim was to guard against Soviet Russia should Stalin decide to interfere in China. Then, in July 1937, the Japanese manufactured an incident with Chinese troops and launched a full-scale invasion. The Rape of China. At first, the Chinese were caught completely off guard, but they rallied fiercely. The Communists even joined forces with Chiang Kai-shek's Kuomintang in a united front against the invaders. The Japanese responded with amphibious assaults up and down the coast. By the end of 1937, they had overrun much of northern China. The Japanese fought this war with exceptional savagery. They bombed cities indiscriminately, showing no mercy to civilian populations. Westerners living in the commercial hub of Shanghai were evacuated as the city came under siege for 3 brutal months. When it finally fell, widespread destruction followed. The Japanese forces showed no pity whatsoever for the native population. But the true horror came after the capture of Nanking, the Chinese capital, on December 17, 1937. What followed was an orgy of violence so extreme it shocked the world. Over 300,000 civilians were massacred during 6 weeks of systematic rape and indiscriminate killing. The Japanese had truly run amok. They even attacked British and American warships sent to protect Western shipping and trade. On December 12, 1937, Japanese bombers sank the American gunboat Panay. 50 crewmen died. Despite this outrage, the Western powers refused to intervene. The League of Nations could do nothing. In the United States, President Roosevelt wanted to impose a naval blockade of Japan. He warned that events in distant parts of the world had far-reaching effects on America. But the British would have none of it, fearing it might trigger war. So Roosevelt could only offer a meager $25 million loan to Chiang Kai-shek to buy arms. The Soviet Union, despite the communists fighting alongside the Kuomintang, did little to help. Its only involvement was a series of border skirmishes with Manchuria. China itself received nothing substantial. It had to fight on alone. During 1938, the Japanese overran Canton and drove Chinese forces deeper into the western interior. All the grand rhetoric of the League of Nations, all those promises to stop international aggression, have been exposed as hollow words. And by now, the Western powers faced aggression much closer to home. Il Duce's ambitions. Today it's easy to laugh at Benito Mussolini, Italy's fascist dictator. All that chest-puffing and posturing seems almost comical now. But it didn't seem that way in 1922. Back then, Italy teetered on the brink of anarchy. The country was convulsed by strikes and land seizures. The democratic government, just as in Germany, seemed utterly powerless against such chaos. Benito Mussolini, a war veteran and journalist, decided to take a stand. He organized a right-wing nationalist party, the Fascists. With the country paralyzed by a general strike in August 1922, Mussolini ordered his followers to march on Rome. Fearing civil war, Italy's King Victor Emmanuel asked him to form a government. Mussolini swiftly crushed all political opposition and seized dictatorial powers. Government officials were appointed rather than elected. All power flowed through the fascist Grand Council. Like Hitler after him, Mussolini's early actions made him immensely popular. Massive public works programs provided employment and transformed Italy's crumbling infrastructure. Corruption was rooted out. The mafia was virtually eliminated. Italy's armed forces were rebuilt, including an advanced modern air force. In the Mediterranean, Mussolini launched a powerful navy bigger than the combined British and French Mediterranean fleets. When the Great Depression struck, Italy seemed to weather it better than most. Mussolini became a source of worldwide inspiration. Political leaders, not least Adolf Hitler, saw fascism as a role model, strong and purposeful, in stark contrast to the perceived weakness of the democracies. But Mussolini wanted more than admiration. He dreamed of recreating the glory of the Roman Empire, and he already had his first target selected, the Abyssinian conquest. Abyssinia, today's Ethiopia. Italy already controlled colonies on its borders, Eritrea and Italian Somaliland. In December 1934, Italian forces deliberately provoked a clash with Abyssinian troops at an oasis in the Ogaden region, well inside Abyssinian territory. Mussolini then dispatched reinforcements to Eritrea and Italian Somaliland, demanding that Abyssinia pay reparations for the incident. Emperor Haile Selassie of Abyssinia appealed in person to the League of Nations. He called on it to live up to its sacred ideals. Here, it was a small nation under threat from another League member. This was a supreme test. The League did nothing. Britain's Foreign Minister Anthony Eden at least attempted to broker a peace deal. Mussolini rejected it with contempt. In early October 1935, the Italian army invaded from both Eritrea and Italian Somaliland. The primitive Abyssinian forces stood no chance against a modern army equipped with artillery and tanks. The Italian Air Force commanded the skies absolutely, harrying the Abyssinians mercilessly. On some occasions, they even dropped poison gas bombs, though gas had been outlawed at Versailles as a crime against humanity. After 6 months of slaughter, Abyssinia was completely overrun. Emperor Haile Selassie fled into exile in Britain. From its headquarters in Switzerland, the League of Nations wrung its hands impotently. It imposed economic sanctions that had virtually no effect. Mussolini's aggression had revealed two devastating truths. The League of Nations, that great hope for eternal peace, was utterly impotent. In both of Europe's supposed major powers, the democracies of Britain and France no longer had the stomach for a fight. The traumatized powers. Both Britain and France had been shattered by World War I. Their economies had never truly recovered. Both had witnessed waves of strikes and civil unrest. Both had suffered mass unemployment even before the Great Depression struck. Both faced the enormous cost of controlling empires now bloated with Germany's former colonies and Middle Eastern territories, once controlled by the Turkish Ottoman Empire. And above all, both nations had been traumatized by the horrific casualties of World War I. An entire generation of young men had been fed into the meat grinder of the Western Front. A succession of British leaders, Lloyd George, Ramsay MacDonald, and especially Stanley Baldwin, all resolved to keep Britain out of future conflicts at almost any cost. Despite the carnage on the Western Front, Britain had ended World War I with a large and devastatingly effective conscript army. This was immediately dismantled, reduced to a small professional force designed merely to police its sprawling empire. When the Great Depression struck, any ideas of modernizing even that small army were abandoned. Britain stumbled into the run-up to war economically and militarily weak. French losses during World War I had been even more catastrophic than Britain's. Ever mistrustful of Germany, France maintained a large conscript army. But throughout the 1920s, France's birth rate had plummeted. By the mid to late 1930s, there would be a critical manpower shortage. France realized it could never match Germany in sheer numbers of soldiers. The Maginot mentality. The solution was to adopt an entirely defensive posture. The Maginot Line, a series of massive fortifications, was begun in 1930 along the frontier with Germany, running all the way to the Belgian border where it theoretically linked up with Belgian fortifications. This new French military doctrine meant France was only capable of waging a defensive war. It simply lacked the ability to launch an offensive against Italy, even with British help, which Britain couldn't provide anyway. Both countries knew their Mediterranean navies were outnumbered by Mussolini's new fleet. So when Italy conquered Abyssinia, both powers chose to do nothing. It seemed too remote, too much someone else's problem. By now, they had to deal with the crushing traumas of the Great Depression. That seemed far more pressing. And they faced a military threat far closer to home. A resurgent and rearming Germany. Germany's power, and Italy's too, was about to be demonstrated in supporting the rise of another dictator in Spain. The Spanish Inferno. Civil war erupted in Spain with exceptional viciousness, setting family against family, communist against fascist, believers against atheists. In 1931, a left-wing government had come to power, determined to abolish the centuries-old Spanish monarchy. The king was forced into exile, and a republic was declared. In February 1936, the parties of the left combined in a popular front to face the forces of the right in a general election. The Popular Front won narrowly. Even though its reform program was modest, a wave of strikes and land seizures led the right to fear that a communist takeover was inevitable. Within the Spanish army, long a bastion of conservative and Catholic thinking, senior officers began plotting a coup. Among them was General Francisco Franco, the former chief of staff who had been effectively exiled to command Spain's forces in the Canary Islands. On July 17, 1936, units of the army fighting guerrillas in Spain's colony of Morocco mutinied. The next day, Franco flew to join them, proclaiming a new nationalist movement that would save Spain from communism. Mainland garrisons joined the revolt. The Popular Front responded by calling for volunteers to defend the Republic. Battle lines were drawn in blood. Fascist intervention. At first, Franco faced a critical problem. He and his army were trapped in North Africa. He had to cross the Straits of Gibraltar back to Spain. So he turned to the one person he thought might help: Adolf Hitler. Within a month, transport aircraft from Hitler's Luftwaffe had begun a massive airlift, ferrying Franco's battle-hardened veterans to southern Spain. At first, the Republic seemed to hold the advantage. Pro-Franco military uprisings in Madrid and Barcelona were crushed quickly, leaving the Republic in control of most of eastern Spain. Franco's nationalists were confined largely to the northwest and part of the south. But the nationalist situation was transformed when Hitler and Mussolini began pouring in troops and weapons. Hitler seized the opportunity to test his new equipment and expanding armed forces. The first Panzer tanks were dispatched along with some 12,000 troops. The Luftwaffe deployed its Condor Legion with ultramodern bombers and fighters. Mussolini sent a so-called volunteer corps of 50,000 men and more than 700 aircraft. The Republicans appealed desperately to Britain, France, and the Soviet Union for help. But London and Paris were terrified of triggering a European war. They declared a policy of non-intervention. Cynically, both Germany and Italy signed up to this non-intervention policy. But when it became obvious they were still flooding arms to the nationalists, Joseph Stalin, the Soviet leader, announced he would help the Republic. Stalin's real worry was the rise of fascism in Germany. Hitler had made it crystal clear that he considered communism to be Nazism's ultimate enemy. Stalin saw the Spanish conflict as a way of keeping Germany and Italy occupied while he built up Soviet military strength. About 700 military advisors were sent to Spain along with tanks and fighter aircraft. It was something, but no match for the support Franco was receiving. The largest source of outside help for the Republic didn't come from any country at all, but from volunteers, the international brigades. About 30,000 left-wing Americans, British, French, and Germans signed up to fight fascism in Spain. The Grinding War. With their new fascist support, the nationalists opened two fronts, one advancing toward Barcelona from the north, the other led by Franco pushing up toward Madrid from the south. By the end of 1936, Madrid was enveloped on three sides, virtually under siege. The fighting was savage and often accompanied by appalling atrocities against civilians. The Republicans hunted down and murdered Roman Catholic priests. The nationalists slaughtered anyone suspected of being communist. German and Italian air power was used indiscriminately against civilian targets. Madrid was heavily bombed. But the worst atrocity came in April 1937 when the Basque town of Guernica was virtually obliterated by aerial bombardment. 6,000 civilians died. The territory controlled by the Republic was steadily ground down. Its forces fought with tremendous courage, but undertrained and under-equipped amateurs were no match for Franco's professional soldiers or the combined modern weaponry of Italy and Germany. As the war dragged on, the fighting around Madrid became a symbol of the left's determination not to be crushed by fascist dictatorship. But behind the scenes, the Republican alliance was disintegrating. The communists and socialists wanted to focus on military victory. But the more idealistic anarchists and syndicalists saw the war as an opportunity for mass revolution by the workers. These disagreements exploded into open conflict in May 1937. Fighting broke out in Barcelona between anarchists and communists. It was a fatal weakening of the Republican cause. By the end of 1938, the nationalists had squeezed their enemy into a small enclave around Barcelona and another stretching eastward from Madrid to the coast. Madrid continued to hold out defiantly, but the international brigades were withdrawn. More and more nations began recognizing Franco's government as his forces closed in for the final assault. At the end of March 1939, after nearly 3 years of exhausting combat, Madrid's defenders finally surrendered. A month later, Franco formally declared hostilities at an end. The scars of Spain's civil war took years to heal. In some ways, they never have. And internationally, Franco's victory proved catastrophic. Hitler and Mussolini were confirmed in their belief that the democracies of Britain and France were too weak to resist real pressure. Stalin despaired of their willingness to confront fascism. Hitler in particular saw his path open to begin the aggressive policies he had outlined in Mein Kampf. Even before the Spanish Civil War ended, his armies were on the march. Hitler unleashed. From a moment he became chancellor on January 30th, 1933, Hitler had begun implementing his long-term ambitions. On February 3rd, he summoned his top commanders and revealed his ultimate aim: to conquer territory in the east and ruthlessly Germanize it. They were ordered to prepare for massive expansion. Although Germany had been forbidden tanks under the Versailles Treaty, a secret treaty with the Soviet Union in 1923 had allowed the development of tank designs and experimentation with new mobile armor tactics. Energetic young German officers like Heinz Guderian devoured the theories of British thinkers like Basil Liddell Hart and Colonel J.F.C. Fuller. They studied British exercises conducted during the 1920s on Salisbury Plain. From these, they developed the concept of fast-moving units combining tanks, artillery, and infantry that could thrust deep into enemy territory at lightning speed. Hitler adopted their ideas with fanatical enthusiasm. The new army would have 3 panzer divisions. Similarly, the new Luftwaffe under former World War I fighter ace Hermann Göring had a framework to build on. Throughout the years when Germany's Air Force was officially banned, the country had maintained its design skills by building civilian aircraft. Gliding and flying clubs provided a reserve of potential pilots. Hitler revealed the existence of the Luftwaffe in March 1935. He then announced that the army would increase to 300,000 men and conscription would be reintroduced. Britain and France protested feebly at this flagrant breach of the Versailles Treaty. Then they reluctantly and slowly began to rearm themselves. The Austrian Anschluss. Until this point, Hitler had been relatively modest in his goals, only reclaiming what he considered German, the Rhineland and the Saar. But now he had a grander target, his homeland, Austria. In 1934, Austrian Nazis had attempted to seize power and unify the country with Germany. After all, Austrians spoke German, even if they had never been part of a unified German state. In February 1938, another Nazi plot was discovered. Austrian Chancellor Kurt von Schuschnigg protested to Hitler. Hitler responded by demanding that Austria stop persecuting Austrian Nazis and unite with Germany. Schuschnigg announced a referendum so Austrians could vote on remaining independent. But on March 12, 1938, the eve of the referendum, Hitler, fearing it might produce the wrong result, sent in his troops. Complete surprise and an enthusiastic welcome by Nazi sympathizers made it a bloodless invasion. Within hours, Hitler announced Austria's incorporation into the Third Reich. For the first time, a sovereign nation had been absorbed into a greater Germany. Once again, the Western democracies failed to react. The Sudeten crisis. In summer 1938, Hitler turned on his next prey, Czechoslovakia. A substantial German minority lived in the northwest, an area known as the Sudetenland. These Sudeten Germans had been part of the old Austrian Empire, but were cut off when Czechoslovakia was created in 1919. This was the time bomb that had begun ticking at Versailles. Hitler encouraged Sudeten German demands for autonomy, then threatened the Czech government with force if it refused. Undaunted, the Czech government ordered general mobilization and prepared to resist. The Czechoslovak army was large, well-equipped, with formidable fortifications on its German frontier. Hitler backed down. But at the beginning of September, concerned that war might be imminent, British Prime Minister Neville Chamberlain decided to act as peacemaker. He flew to meet Hitler twice. The Nazi dictator assured him that if he could have the Sudetenland, he would make no further territorial demands in Europe. In Munich on September 29, 1938, with Mussolini acting as mediator, France and Britain signed an agreement giving the Sudetenland to Germany in return for Hitler's formal declaration that he had no more territorial ambitions. Chamberlain flew back to Britain waving the piece of paper, claiming it guaranteed peace in our time. On October 1st, German troops occupied the Sudetenland and seized the Czech frontier fortifications. Hitler now began sizing up his next target, Poland. The final steps to war. Again, the nominal cause was a German minority marooned by the Versailles Treaty. Hitler demanded the return of the port of Danzig to German control so East Prussia could be linked with the rest of Germany. The Poles refused. Hitler hesitated. He wasn't quite ready for all-out war, and he had unfinished business with Czechoslovakia. In March 1939, Slovakia, the eastern part of Czechoslovakia, ethnically different from the Czech lands, appealed to Hitler for help in achieving independence. Hitler summoned Czechoslovak Prime Minister Emil Hacha to Berlin and browbeat him into putting his country under German protection. German troops marched into the rest of Czechoslovakia unopposed. Most of the country was annexed into the Reich. Slovakia was declared a protectorate. For the first time, Hitler had seized non-German-speaking territory. But again, there was only feeble protest from Britain and France. At the end of March, Hitler repeated his demand. Poland must give up Danzig. This time, France and Britain declared unequivocally that they would declare war if he attacked Poland. But by now, Hitler cared little whether they did or not. He was certain they would be weak and indecisive opponents. The devil's bargain. In Russia, Stalin had become increasingly alarmed by Hitler's aggression. In April, Stalin proposed an alliance with Britain and France. But negotiations made little progress. Finally, Stalin despaired and decided there was another solution to the German threat. On August 23rd, the world was stunned. The Soviet Union and the Third Reich, everyone had believed they were sworn enemies, announced a non-aggression pact. The agreement secretly specified that Poland would be divided between them. Stalin would have a free hand to take over Estonia, Latvia, and Lithuania. Now free from any Russian threat, Hitler ordered his armed forces to prepare for immediate invasion. The storm unleashed. On the evening of August 31st, the German Wehrmacht prepared for assault. Its Führer had made the decision that would plunge the entire world into war. The machinery of death was ready. The tanks were fueled. The aircraft were armed. The troops were positioned. September 1st, 1939, dawned with fire and thunder as German forces crashed across the Polish border. The Second World War had begun.